All right, the first thing you need to know to get started playing acoustic guitar and rock music is you need to know your first position chords. These are often called cowboy chords from the cowboys that played chords like this in the movies. So let's start with those essential first position chords. All right, let's start with a G major chord. Our next chord is a C chord. And you could also play the C chord by putting your ring finger 3rd fret of the 6th string to add what's known as 5th in the bass, because this is the 5th of the chord. And we have a D chord. And we could drop a low 3rd in the chord. It's called 3rd in the bass, because F sharp is the 3rd of D. So I'm doing that with my thumb, 2nd fret. And we have an F chord, which could also be played like this. Just as we had done with the C, we use our ring finger to put a 5th in the bass for the F chord, which fills out the sound of the chord. Then we have an E chord and an A chord, which could also be fingered like this. All right, let's begin with some basic strumming patterns. These are very simple strumming patterns that you hear all the time in acoustic rock style music. You hear it in the music of Bruce Springsteen and Creedence Clearwater Revival. You hear it in the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. This is just a very simple basic strum, and what you need to keep in mind is the role of the acoustic guitar oftentimes in rock music is to drive the beat and keep the beat going. So the way to do that when you play acoustic guitar is you need to consistently strum down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up with your strumming hand. And then if you want to have moments where the chord is not heard, sounds in between, there are techniques involved to stop the sound of the chord. So we're going to get into that. But first, here's your first basic strumming pattern. And this is going to be a chord progression in the key of G, and we're going to use the chords G, C, and D. 1, 2, 3, and... Now let's change this pattern a little bit. What I did in the first pattern is I had a downstroke on beat 1, and then on beat 2 I had a dead string hit, and then I caught it on the upstroke. So down, down, up, up, down, up, down, down, up, up, down, up, down. And what's happening here is on beats 2 and 4, I'm hitting a dead string accent, which if you were playing with a band, that's where the snare hits would be, and it accentuates the drive of the beat and the snare hits. So the way I do that is my right hand comes down and the pick goes across the strings, but simultaneously my palm lands on the strings to create the deadened sound. In this next strumming pattern, I'm going to add an upstroke on beat 1, so it's going to sound like. So it's a little bit busier, but again, the most important thing to keep in mind is to have solid time and lock into the beat. And you're going to hear stuff like this and strumming patterns like this in the music of Bob Seger and John Mellencamp, and just straight, typical country, folk, Americana type rock. 1, 2, 3, and... In the 2 chord progressions I was just using to show you these basic strumming patterns, I was using the 1 chord, the 4 chord, and the 5 chord. And it could be referred to as a 1-4-5 chord progression because those are the chords that it uses. Now you may have heard that term before, a 1-4-5 chord progression, and said to yourself, what does that mean? Where does that come from? So where that comes from is the key, whatever key you're in, that's the 1, and then if you follow the structure of the major scale in that key, each of the scale degrees represents a chord that's relative to its position in the scale. So to illustrate that, if I were to play a G major scale, G is the root note, here's the scale. So G is the 1, or the root note. And that would be the 1 chord, because that's the key we're in. A is the 2nd note in the scale, so that's the 2nd scale degree, and that's the 2nd in the key of G. B is the 3rd note, so that's the 3rd in the key of G. And C is the 4th note in the G major scale, so that's the 4, that's known as the 4. So when we have the 1 chord G, the 4 chord would be a C chord. And all the chords we're playing are just straight major chords. The 5th scale degree, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, is a D. So if you play a major chord with that as the root note, that's known as the 5 chord. So we have the 1 is G, the 4 is C, and the 5 is D. Now chords could be built from each of the scale degrees, and we're going to get into that in a little while. And that gives you the structure of chord relationships that work within a key, and you'll hear more chords used in all kinds of different songs other than the 1, the 4, and the 5. But for our purposes right now, we're sticking with the 1-4-5.